On a broken piece of slate at Tintagel, on the windswept Cornish coast, archaeologists brushed away centuries of soil and found a name someone had carved there long ago and never explained. The letters spelled out a man who lived in a Britain that no chronicle remembers, no king list records, no monk ever thought worth writing down. Somewhere between the year 400 and the year 800, almost 4 centuries slipped past, leaving barely a page, barely a name, barely a single certain date behind them. Rome had gone. Its roads cracked. Its written world went quietly with it. Before we go down there, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if these quiet journeys help you drift off, hit subscribe, settle in, and let the candlelight do its work. Tonight, we follow that carved name, that broken slate, that single fragile thread back into the darkest, quietest stretch of British history, where the answers, where they exist at all, are buried under later rubble, contradicted by later legend, or simply half erased by time itself, and where every fact must be coaxed gently out of silence. Picture a garrison town in the north, somewhere along the line where Roman Britain met the wild country beyond. Its barracks built of good-dressed stone, its baths still warm, its granaries still full of grain grown by British hands under a British sky that had known 4 centuries of eagles on its standards. Soldiers here spoke Latin and worshipped a dozen gods at once, sometimes in the same afternoon. They mended roads. They paid in coins stamped with the faces of emperors most of them would never see and could not have named. Beyond the wall, traders came and went with wool and hides, and news from garrisons further south, and for as long as anyone could remember, that had simply been how the world worked. And then, in the space of a single generation, the orders came. Not to strengthen this frontier, not to reinforce that wall, but to leave it. Rome itself was drowning. Goths were at the gates of the eternal city. Usurpers were rising and falling in Gaul faster than messengers could carry the news between one crisis and the next. And every legion still standing was needed at home, on the Rhine, on the Danube, anywhere but here, on this damp island at the edge of the map. Britain, it was decided far away in rooms no Briton ever entered, would have to look after itself. The men marched south to the coast. The ships that had once carried grain and wine and official correspondence now carried away the last professional soldiers Britain would see for a very long time to come. Behind them, they left forts with their gates still hung, granaries with their doors still sound, bathhouses with their fires barely cold, and a population who had spent 400 years being told, quietly and constantly, that someone else did the fighting for them. No great battle marked the departure. No burning, no siege, no final stand at the gate. Just wagons rolling south along roads the army itself had built, and a silence spreading slowly northward behind them, town by town, farm by farm, like water finding its own level in the dark. What survives of that precise moment is astonishingly thin. A single sentence, reported second-hand, decades after the fact, by a Greek historian who never set foot on the island he was describing. He tells us of a letter sent by the Emperor Honorius in the year 410, in reply to Britons who had written to Rome begging for help against raiders harrying their coasts. Honorius wrote back, and what he told them, in words that only barely survived the journey from one language and one century into another, was that they should look to their own defences, because Rome, at that moment, had none whatsoever to spare. No parchment survives, no seal, no original hand that we can point to and say, here, this is the very page that ended an empire's grip on an island. Just a paraphrase of a paraphrase, quoted by a chronicler working in Constantinople, describing a decision that closed an occupation of nearly 4 centuries in barely more than a sentence of second-hand Greek. Historians still argue, gently and endlessly, over whether Honorius even meant Britain at all, or whether he meant a town in southern Italy that happened to share an almost identical name. The debate has run for more than a century now, in journals and lecture halls, without ever quite resolving, because the only evidence anyone can bring to it is that same borrowed sentence, turned over and over like a coin worn too smooth to read. That such uncertainty could hang over the single most consequential letter in the island's ancient history tells you something quietly unsettling. The moment Rome let go, the thread of reliable record let go with it, and it would not be picked up again for a very long time. No British voice from that year survives to tell us how the news landed, whether with relief, with terror, or with simple disbelief that the guarantee of centuries had ended in a single line of borrowed Greek. We are left, at the very hinge of the story, listening to an echo of an echo, and calling it history because it is all we have. Along the line of Hadrian's Wall, and in the muddy fields that fall away behind it, the soil itself keeps a quieter, more physical kind of testimony. In these very decades, hoards of coin begin to go into the ground in numbers that had never been seen before on this island. Small clay pots and leather purses packed tight with silver and worn bronze, buried under hearths, beneath thresholds, in the corners of yards and the edges of fields, wherever a frightened hand could return for them quickly once the danger passed. Some hoards are modest, no more than a season's wages carefully set aside, a widow's caution against a bad winter, or a raiding party seen too close to the fence line. Others run to many thousands of coins, wealth that would once have meant real security for an entire family for years to come. And here is the detail that ought to sit with you a moment, quiet and strange. Almost none of them were ever dug up again. Whoever buried that silver beneath the Northumbrian floor, whoever pressed those coins into a jar and covered it over with turf, never came back to spend it. Perhaps they died before they could return to the spot. Perhaps, in the press of other troubles, they simply forgot exactly where the ground had swallowed their savings. Or perhaps, and this is the thought worth keeping close, the world they had buried it for, a world where Roman coins still bought Roman goods at a Roman market under Roman law, had already stopped existing by the time they might have gone looking. Archaeologists still lift these hoards from the earth today, the coins bright where the clay protected them, dull where damp crept in over 16 centuries of patient waiting. Each one is a small private emergency, frozen mid-decision and never resolved. A hand reached into the dark, let go of everything it owned, and the story simply stops there, mid-breath, waiting still. Stone tells its own version of the same story, and it tells it by falling silent. For nearly 400 years, Roman Britain had inscribed itself everywhere it could reach, on milestones and tombstones, on altars to household gods, and formal dedications to distant emperors, on the bases of statues and the lintels of public buildings, each one carved to be read by someone, dated carefully by consulship or imperial year, so that a passerby centuries later could know exactly when it had been cut and by whose authority. And then, within a handful of decades either side of that letter from Honorius, the inscriptions simply end. The last securely dated stone from Roman Britain belongs to the opening years of the 5th century, and after it there is close to nothing at all. No more milestones raised along the roads, no more formal tombstones cut with a name and a rank and a length of years faithfully lived, no more altars set up to gods who had been worshipped on this soil since long before the wall was ever built. It is not that people stopped dying. It is not that they stopped believing or stopped needing somewhere to mark a grave and grieve beside it. It is that the entire habit of writing something down in durable stone, meant to last, meant to be read by strangers, long after the hand that carved it had turned to dust, appears to have simply stopped being useful to anyone at all, almost overnight by the standards of an empire. Whatever skills a mason once carried, whatever workshop once cut clean Roman letters into local sandstone for a paying customer, both the skill and the customer seemed to fade from the record within the span of 2 lifetimes. The chisels did not vanish. The hands that might have held them simply had nothing left to say in a language of state that no longer had a state behind it. And that is perhaps the strangest fact of all in this whole opening chapter of a long, dark story. Britain, in the year 400, was not some empty, forgotten corner of the world, thinly peopled and easily overlooked. It held perhaps 2 million souls, cities with paved streets and heated floors, villas with mosaic pavements still bright underfoot, a literate administrative class who had spent generations reading and writing Latin as naturally as breathing, filing returns and copying letters without a second thought. Within 2 or 3 generations, that same crowded, literate, thoroughly Roman landscape produces almost nothing in writing that anyone today still possesses. Not tax rolls, not private letters between friends or family, not one chronicle written by someone who watched it happen and thought simply to set it down for those who came after. A society that had recorded itself faithfully in stone and ink for 400 years simply stops speaking to us all at once and leaves us standing here centuries later in the quiet, guessing softly at the reasons why. Was the knowledge simply lost, burned or rotted, or thrown out with each passing generation that had less use for it than the last? Or was it something quieter still, a whole world deciding, without ever quite meaning to, that the old way of keeping account no longer fit the shape of the days it was living through? Either way, the silence that follows is where our story truly begins. Beneath the fields near modern Shrewsbury lie the bones of a city that once ranked 4th in size among all the towns of Roman Britain, a place called Viroconium, known to us now as Wroxeter. Its bathhouse still stands. A single wall of stacked red brick rises taller than a house, the last upright fragment of a public building where thousands once queued to sweat, to gossip, to trade news from 3 provinces at once. Walk close to that wall today, and the old mortar still holds. Chalk dust still clings to its lower courses after rain. Grass grows thick in what was once a marketplace, and sheep graze quietly where merchants haggled over British wool and continental wine, over olive oil shipped up from the Mediterranean in heavy amphorae, over glass beads and dried spices carried the length of an empire just to reach this cold western frontier. Birdsong fills the space where footsteps and cartwheels once echoed off stone. It is easy to forget standing among sheep on a damp morning, that this quiet field once held heated floors, painted plaster walls in ochre and blue, perhaps a small library, a basilica loud with disputes over debts and boundaries and inheritance. The town had its own aqueduct once, its own forum paved in stone slabs worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet, its own council of local worthies who governed daily life in Latin long after the imperial court had stopped answering their letters. For a long time, historians told a simple story about towns like this one. They said that when the legions left, the lights went out at once. They said the baths went cold in a single winter, the forum fell silent within a season, the whole apparatus of Roman living collapsing the moment nobody remained to enforce it. It was a tidy story. It fit the shape of a fall we already expected. And it was largely wrong. Wroxeter says otherwise, and it says so in timber and post holes, rather than in any surviving page, because nobody at the time thought to write down what a dying town looked like from the inside. Or perhaps nobody there believed it was dying at all. When archaeologists cut careful trenches through the old Bath Basilica, first in the 1960s, and then again with far greater precision across 2 decades in the 1980s and 90s under Philip Barker's patient excavation, they found something nobody expected inside a supposedly dying town. They found a confident rebuild. New halls rose across the old Bath's footprint, laid out on a Roman grid, built to Roman proportions, raised by people who still thought in Roman measurements long after any government in Rome could have paid a single coin toward them. Colonnaded walkways were replanned with genuine skill, their spacing measured out with a surveyor's care rather than guesswork. Whoever directed this work still understood proportion, still understood how a public space ought to feel to the people walking through it, and still cared enough to get it right, rather than simply patch what remained standing. Post holes marched in careful rows where classical columns once stood, spaced with the same practiced eye that had raised the empire's forums centuries before. Someone here still knew how to survey a straight street through fallen rubble. Someone still had the labor, the seasoned oak, the iron tools, and the patient will to keep a Roman town looking like a Roman town, decades after the last legion had marched south to the coast and never come back north again. Some of these timber halls were vast, larger by far than many a medieval great hall built centuries afterward in solid stone. Clear evidence of wealth and organization that simply should not have existed in a supposedly collapsing province, according to the old story. Whoever paid for that oak and whoever fed the carpenters who raised it still commanded real resources in a Britain the old textbooks had already written off as broken. That is the quiet shock buried at Wroxeter, waiting in the soil for anyone patient enough to dig for it. No other Roman town in Britain has offered up quite this clear a picture of deliberate, planned continuity, which is part of why Wroxeter matters so much to anyone trying to understand these missing centuries. Britain did not fall the day Rome withdrew its officials. Some part of it endured here, stubborn and organized, propped up by builders and planners, and perhaps even magistrates, whose names we will never recover from any surviving record. Men and women who kept faith with a way of living that the rest of the story had already given up for dead. They had no emperor to answer to, no legion to protect them, and yet for a while they built anyway, as though habit alone could hold a civilization together. And then, just as strangely as it had risen again, it stopped. By the early 500s, the town falls quiet a second time, And this second silence is stranger than the first, because nothing violent seems to explain it at all. Timber halls were not replaced when their posts finally rotted through at the base. Rubbish stopped piling in the same familiar corners it always had for generations before. The post holes that once held those confident new buildings were never redug for anything newer, and where a doorway once stood, only bare, undisturbed earth remained, waiting patiently for the archaeologists who would eventually come looking. Sometime in those early decades of the 6th century, whatever community had kept this Roman grid alive simply let it go, and the grass crept back in over the old gravelled streets, first in thin scattered patches, then everywhere at once, until sheep grazed where carts had once rattled past. No fire at all is recorded here. No battle is whispered of in any later poem. No name of an enemy survives. No siege is remembered. No chronicle entry marks the day the last resident latched a final door behind them and walked away towards somewhere else entirely, somewhere unnamed. The town does not end with an event that anyone thought worth writing down for later generations to read. It ends with an absence, a slow unweaving that left no one behind to describe it. Only the post holes to speak for those who once stood in them. Only the buried gravel to hint at where feet had worn a path 1,000 times before falling still. Dating any of this precisely is its own kind of puzzle, because the easiest clock of the Roman world, minted coin, stops working here decades before the story itself finally runs out. Roman coin circulation across Britain dries up within a few decades of 410, as fresh supply from continental mints simply stops arriving on British shores, and the old coins already in circulation were too smooth and too debased to trust for dating anything with real confidence. So archaeologists cannot follow coins through Wroxeter's rebuilding, through its confident new halls, through its long, slow abandonment afterward, the way a historian elsewhere might follow a hoard neatly through a reign. The clock that works everywhere else in the Roman world simply falls silent here, decades too early to be any real use at all. Instead, they read the darkness through pottery shards and post holes. A single sherd of imported red slipware, a scrap of glass, a scatter of animal bone in a rubbish pit, each becomes a fragile signpost in a landscape with almost no other markers left standing. They read it through faint chemical signatures of ash and old dung layered into the soil, through timber post pipes whose wood rotted away centuries ago and left only the ghost of their shape pressed into the clay beneath the plough. It is dating by shadow. It is dating by absence, by the negative space where something solid used to stand and no longer does, by the width of a dark stain in pale soil where a post once bore real weight through a real winter. And it leaves one deeply human question hanging quietly over the whole excavated site, a question no trench has ever fully answered, no matter how carefully the soil is sifted. When a town's population does not appear again in any tax roll, any bishop's list, any surviving letter from a nervous official writing to a friend across the water in Gaul, where do those people actually go? Do they scatter out into the countryside, folding back into farms and hamlets that never once stopped needing hands to work them, trading a market stall for a plough and a market square for a muddy yard? Do they drift toward whichever local strongman could still feed a household, trading citizenship for protection in a world where citizenship no longer meant very much to anyone holding a spear at the gate? Do a handful even travel west, toward the hills, carrying whatever memory of Roman order still felt worth preserving? Or do some of them simply stay, in far smaller numbers, tending a few gardens among the fallen colonnades, growing old among ruins their own grandparents had helped to build with their hands 2 generations before? Nobody wrote any of it down, and so nobody alive today can say for certain, not yet, and perhaps not ever. Wroxeter keeps its silence the way the fields around it keep their own, patient under grass and chalk and centuries of quiet rain, waiting for the next careful trench to ask its soil another question it might, one day, finally answer. Somewhere in the wreckage of that abandoned city, a name begins to surface, and it belongs to a man almost no one can agree on. They call him Vortigern. Later writers give him a title heavier than any crown, a high king ruling over Britons who had no emperor left to answer to, no legions left to call on, no Rome left to petition. But strip away the later chroniclers, strip away the poems and the genealogies stitched on afterward, and there is almost nothing solid underneath. No coin bears his face, no contemporary charter carries his seal, no inscription on stone names him while he still drew breath. Nothing survives from his own lifetime at all. The earliest writer to mention him at all was working a full century or more after the man was supposed to have lived, gathering rumour the way you might gather driftwood from a beach, shaping it into a story because plain silence was unbearable to a Christian mind that needed reasons for ruin. So, who was he really? A single ambitious warlord, holding the fractured diocese together through sheer will and a hard bargain with strangers? Or something plainer and far stranger, not a name at all, but a title, a word, meaning something close to overlord, passed down from one petty ruler to the next, until the men who wore it blurred together into a single legendary figure standing in for a whole disordered century. Think of it less as a single face and more as a crown passed hand to hand in the dark, each new wearer inheriting both the authority and the blame of everyone who wore it before him. Historians still argue over which is true, and neither side can produce the proof that would settle it. Later, Welsh tradition even gives him a different shape entirely, calling him Gwrthern, wrapping him in prophecy and a doomed tower and a red dragon fighting a white one beneath the foundations. None of that belongs to the man himself. It belongs to the centuries that needed a face to put on their fear. That argument alone tells you almost everything about how thin the 5th century truly is, and how eager later ages were to fill the silence with someone, anyone worth naming. Out of that same fog comes one of the strangest documents to survive the age at all, a letter later known as the Groans of the Britons, addressed, so the story goes, to a Roman commander named Aetius across the water. The barbarians drive us to the sea, it says. The sea drives us back to the barbarians, and between these two kinds of death, we are either drowned or slaughtered. It is a plea, stripped bare of ornament, written by people who had run out of other options. It is also, quite possibly, a ghost. Nobody can say for certain that the letter ever reached Roman hands, that Aetius himself read it, or that help was ever seriously weighed against the cost of sending it. Some historians think it never left British shores at all, a private lament copied later for its raw beauty and its despair, rather than for any real diplomacy behind it. Others think it truly did cross the sea and was quietly set aside, because Rome by then had wolves scratching at its own gates and nothing left over to spend on an island at the edge of the map. Aetius himself, after all, was busy holding back a different flood of invaders on the continent, and Britain had already been told decades earlier to look to its own defences. Either way, the message survives while the outcome does not, and that gap is worth sitting inside for a moment. Picture the scene for a moment. A candlelit room somewhere near the coast, a scribe bent over parchment, choosing his words as carefully as a man bailing water from a sinking boat. He does not know if the boat will reach anyone at all. We know the Britons asked. We simply do not know, and may never know, whether anyone on the other side of that grey water was even listening, or whether the plea simply dissolved into the same silence that swallowed so much else from these 400 years. While the plea drifts unanswered somewhere between memory and myth, the old Roman diocese is quietly coming apart at every seam that once held it together. There is no central mint-striking coin any longer, so trade slips backward toward barter and favour, and whatever a neighbour will trust you for. There are no charters recording who owns which field or which stretch of forest, so ownership becomes a matter of memory, muscle, and whoever can hold a boundary by force. Little kingdoms rise where whole provinces once sat under a single governor, each one small enough to be ruled from a single hillside, each one led by a man whose name has mostly failed to reach us across the centuries. Borders drift with each season's fighting rather than sitting fixed on any surveyor's map. Alliances form over a single shared meal and dissolve just as quickly once the food is gone. Picture the old province breaking apart like ice on a winter pond, cracking into a dozen unequal pieces, each piece cold and separate now, each one answering to no authority above it. A handful of names do cling on through later poetry and genealogy, half real and half invented, kings of Gwent or Powys, or borderlands long since forgotten, whose halls left no stone foundation behind them, only a whisper preserved in some later monk's careful list. It is a landscape ruled by candlelight and spoken oath rather than by laws set down in ink. No archive holds a single tax roll from this world. No court holds a single sealed judgment. Archaeologists find scattered hill forts refortified in haste, and a handful of imported pottery sherds, and precious little else to hang a kingdom's name upon. A broken brooch here, a collapsed timber post there. Fragments, never a full sentence. That absence of the written word is precisely why so little of it can ever be proven beyond doubt, and why every map historians draw of these petty kingdoms comes stitched together more from guesswork and later legend than from anything a 5th century hand actually wrote down. Two churchmen, writing generations apart from each other, tried to make sense of this same wreckage and arrived at almost nothing in common. Gildas, composing his furious sermon perhaps 100 years after the events he claims to describe, writes with the fury of a preacher rather than the caution of a historian, and he paints Vortigern as a fool and a tyrant, a man who let wolves into the sheepfold through his own arrogance and appetite. Bede, writing later still and leaning heavily on Gildas for his raw material, shifts the dates around, softens a few of the accusations, and quietly sets the whole affair in a slightly different year than his source ever claimed. Neither man was there to see it. Neither one interviewed a single living witness. Neither one, in truth, had much interest in getting the facts right for their own sake, since both were writing sermons dressed up as history, warnings aimed at their own troubled present, rather than sober accounts of a vanished past. They disagree on when the invitation happened, on why it happened, and even if you read closely enough between the lines, on whether Vortigern was one flesh and blood ruler at all, or a title inherited in turn by several. When your only two surviving sources contradict each other on the basic facts of the case, you are no longer quite reading history. You are reading argument, two candles guttering in the same dark room, throwing two different shadows across the very same wall. Later, medieval writers only muddy things further, borrowing from both men, inventing conversations neither Gildas nor Bede ever recorded, adding sons and daughters and betrayals that read more like folklore gathering weight with each retelling than like remembered fact. By the time later chroniclers are finished with him, Vortigern carries a whole library's worth of contradiction on his shoulders. So the man standing at the center of this section may never have existed in quite the shape either writer imagined for him, and that uncertainty is itself the truest thing worth carrying forward. A ruler remembered chiefly through the complaints of men born generations after his death is no longer quite a person. He has become something closer to a shape pressed into fog, a convenient villain for churchmen who needed someone to blame for Britain's unravelling, a convenient founder for later poets who needed a king to stand at the root of their genealogies. Whichever he truly was, one man or a worn title, tyrant or scapegoat, he stood at the hinge of an age that kept almost no records of itself, and the ground beneath him gives a little more each time a historian tries to stand on it. Perhaps he was a proud man, undone by a single desperate decision, made in fear rather than malice. Perhaps he was never one man at all, only a name later ages needed someone to fill. Either way, what survives of him is not a life but an accusation, passed hand to hand across centuries until the original voice beneath it can no longer be heard. Let him rest there now, half king and half rumour, candlelight guttering over an argument 400 years old, while the story turns gently toward the strangers he is said, by some, to have invited in himself. There is one voice from this whole silent age that speaks to us directly, and it is not a kind one. His name was Gildas, a monk writing perhaps 100 years after the legions left these shores, working by candlelight in some damp western cell where the ink froze in winter and the parchment came dear. Nobody commissioned this book. Nobody paid him to write it. He wrote, by his own account, weeping as he wrote, wringing his hands over a Britain he believed God himself had abandoned to punish her sins. And he was furious. Not at invaders, not at the raiders crossing grey water toward these coasts under cover of fog. At his own people. His book is called On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, and it reads less like history than like a sermon delivered through clenched teeth, a long complaint aimed squarely at 5 British kings he accuses of tyranny, of greed, of cowardice dressed up as leadership. He calls one a lion's whelp. He calls another a stained bear who sits on a throne he never earned. He piles up scripture and insult in the same breath, as though the Old Testament prophets were standing just behind his shoulder, watching him work. He quotes Jeremiah in one line and hurls a private grudge in the next, and the seam between the two is never visible to us. He does not want to explain what happened to Britain, not truly, not in any way we would recognize. He wants to condemn it, syllable by bitter syllable, as though naming the sin loudly enough might somehow undo it. And so the very document historians lean on hardest for this entire period was never meant to inform anyone at all. it was meant to shame. That is the first strange thing about Gildas, and once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. He assumes his readers already know the story he is retelling. He never once gives a date, not a single year fixed against any calendar we could check today. He barely names any place at all, content instead to speak only in shadows, of the island, of the cities, of ruin in the abstract, rather than ruin at any particular gate or wall or river crossing. Where a modern historian would want years laid end to end, battles in careful sequence, names cross-checked against inscriptions on stone, Gildas gives only fury and metaphor, page after page of it, as if precision itself were beneath his purpose. He calls Britain a vine grown wild and untended, its fruit gone sour, its branches choked with weeds nobody troubled to clear. He calls her king's tyrants, without ever troubling to say when they ruled, or exactly where their small kingdoms lay, or how long any one of them held power before the next seized it in turn. Only a small handful of individuals, perhaps 5 in all, get named across the whole furious text, and even those names arrive without introduction, dropped into the sermon as though every listener already understood precisely who they were and what they had done to earn his contempt. A king here, a tyrant there. No genealogy, no reign length, no year of death offered alongside any of them. We do not. 14 centuries later, we are left squinting at a private, furious letter written for an audience that vanished along with him, trying to reconstruct a working timeline out of a text that never once wanted to give us one. And then, almost in passing, buried inside a sentence that seems far more interested in scolding the living than in recording the dead, Gildas drops the single line that has caused more argument among historians than almost any other sentence to survive from Dark Age Britain. He mentions a siege and a great victory won by the Britons against the invading Saxons, at a place he names only as Mons Badonicus, the hill of Baden. He gives no year for it. He gives no leader's name for the victors, no general, no king raising a standard on that hillside at dawn while mist still clung to the grass below. He simply notes, almost as an aside, that this triumph happened, that it purchased decades of uneasy peace afterward, and that he himself was born in the very same year that the battle was fought. A birth he mentions only to measure his own age, never to help us measure anything else. That single scrap of personal detail, tossed off so lightly, has launched 1,000 academic careers and ended nearly as many friendly dinners among historians. Because if you could only fix the year of Baden with any confidence, you could begin to date almost everything else Gildas describes around it, like hanging a whole loose tapestry from one solid nail driven into old stone. Nobody, in all the centuries since, has ever managed to drive that nail home with any real certainty at all. Archaeologists have hunted for the hill itself across half of southern Britain, proposing Bath, proposing Badbury, proposing a dozen quiet rises of chalk and turf that could just as easily be nowhere at all. Consider, for a moment, what that actually means, and how strange it truly is. A war that shaped the fate of an entire island, one that contemporaries plainly remembered as decisive, as the thing that bought their children a generation of quiet fields and unburned roofs, survives today as a single unlocated sentence tucked inside an angry sermon. Later writers, centuries afterward, would attach a name to that victory, a name that would echo down through legend long after the true details had rotted away with the parchment that first recorded them. But Gildas himself, our nearest witness, names no commander at Baden. He leaves us a triumph without a general standing behind it, a battlefield without any map we can trust, a turning point floating free of any calendar, drifting somewhere in nearly 100 years of fog and candle smoke, unresolved. Whole books have been written trying to pin that fog down, and every one of them ends quietly in the same shrug. The uncertainty does not stop at the battle either, not by any measure. It swallows Gildas himself, whole, name and dates and all. Scholars have spent generations arguing over when he actually put pen to parchment, and the honest, uncomfortable answer is that nobody truly knows for certain. Some place his writing in the 480s, barely a lifetime removed from the events he condemns so bitterly, which would make him a near contemporary witness, someone who might have spoken directly with people who remembered Baden firsthand, who had felt that peace settle over the fields. Others push him forward to the 530s, 2 full generations later than that, changing him from something like an eyewitness into a distant, embittered collector of old rumour and half-remembered grievance passed down at second or third hand. A few push the date later still into a haze where Gildas himself starts to feel almost as legendary, almost as unreachable as the very kings he attacks with such certainty. Move his lifetime by 50 years in either direction, and the whole shape of the sub-Roman story shifts along with it. Because so much of what we think we securely know about this era is anchored, whether historians admit it comfortably or not, to one uncertain monk's own uncertain place in time. 50 years, one way, and a name becomes a memory. 50 years the other, and that same name becomes only a rumour of a rumour. Historians have built entire careers defending each possible date, and none of the 3 camps has ever managed to fully silence the others. Sit with how much weight that single manuscript is quietly asked to carry, 400 years balanced on one man's temper. Kings, battles, a hard-won and fragile peace, the slow fall of whole British kingdoms into Saxon hands across 100 forgotten skirmishes. Nearly all of it reaches us filtered through the anger of one monk who never meant to write history at all, only a warning to sinful rulers he personally despised, penned in his own damp corner of a shrinking, frightened world. Copyists preserved his angry words for reasons that had nothing to do with preserving plain fact and everything to do with piety. Monasteries kept his book alive as moral instruction, a warning against sin, not as a record anyone thought future generations would need for dates. Later, chroniclers borrowed his phrases, his kings, his small handful of names, and built entire elaborate narratives on top of a sermon that was never designed to bear that kind of weight in the first place. Every later writer who touched this period touched Gildas first, whether they admitted it or not, copying his complaints into their own chronicles, centuries after his ink had dried and his anger had cooled into scripture. Strip Gildas away, just for a moment, and the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain would fall almost entirely silent again. A long run of years with barely a human voice attached to any of them at all. Small wonder, then, that so much of what people confidently call knowledge from this age is really just careful, patient reading of one furious man's private grievance. A single voice, echoing through a silence 4 centuries wide, candlelit and half-explained, still waiting quietly for anyone patient enough to listen for what he chose never to say. On a shingle beach at Ebbsfleet, on the Isle of Thanet, tradition places the arrival of 2 brothers whose names still echo through English schoolbooks, Hengist and Horsa. Stallion and horse, both names mean almost the same word twice, and that alone should give you pause before you trust anything else about them. They came, so the story goes, not as raiders, but as hired men, Federate brought in on contract to fight for a British warlord against enemies he could no longer hold back alone. Vortigern needed spears he did not have, and he is said to have looked across the grey water for them, rather than to his own exhausted people. His own levies were thin, his own coffers thinner, and Rome was 3 decades gone by then. The newcomers, so the tale runs, agreed to serve for land, for grain, for a foothold on a shrinking island that could no longer feed or defend itself. 3 ships, some versions say. Others say more arrived later, quietly, once the first foothold had proven safe, ship after ship, following the first across a sea that had, for 4 centuries, belonged to Rome. Picture the scene as later storytellers imagined it. Keels grinding on wet shingle, gulls wheeling overhead, a British steward walking down to meet armed strangers with an uneasy kind of hope. Nobody wrote any of it down at the time. No monk stood on that shore with ink and vellum ready. There was only shingle, salt wind, and whatever words passed between strangers meeting on a beach. It reads like the opening lines of a saga passed around a hall fire, not like a page torn from an official register. And that, in large part, is exactly what it is, dressed centuries later in the borrowed authority of a chronicle. The fullest surviving version comes from the monk Bede, writing far off in the northeast of England in the year 731, nearly 3 full centuries after the events he claims to describe. 300 years is an extraordinary distance for any story to travel by word of mouth before someone finally commits it to parchment. Think of how a tale changes in just 3 tellings around a table, then multiply that drift across 10 generations of firelight retelling. Names sharpen, motives simplify, villains grow clearer, and heroes grow braver with every retelling. Bede leaned heavily on Gildas, writing 2 centuries earlier still, and Gildas himself gave no precise year, no ship count, no named beach, no brothers by name at all. Only a vague and furious account of treacherous foreigners invited in by a foolish ruler. The tidy details arrived later. The brothers' matching horse names, the exact landing site at Ebbsfleet, the neat narrative arc of invitation followed swiftly by betrayal and bloodshed. Much of this likely hardened into shape only through generations of retelling, each teller smoothing the tale a little further toward meaning rather than toward accuracy. Historians today tend to read Hengist and Horsa less as 2 verified individual men and more as origin figures, the kind of paired founder heroes who keep resurfacing whenever a people needs a clean, memorable beginning to point back to. Such twinned founders appear again and again across early medieval Europe, wearing different names but the same symmetrical shape. Brothers who divide a kingdom between them. Brothers who found a dynasty from nothing but a landing and a promise. The pattern itself, so neat, so narratively satisfying, is itself a kind of warning against believing it too literally. Real history rarely arranges itself into matched pairs on command. A story this shapely was built for the telling around a fire, not for the scrutiny of a courtroom, and Bede, for all his careful chronology elsewhere, was still a man of his own age, gathering fragments and giving them a spine they may never have possessed. He wrote, after all, to explain his own present, a Christian English kingdom, by reaching backward for a foundation myth that made sense of it. Set the chronicle aside for a moment, then, and let the ground speak instead. It tends to be a far more patient and far less flattering witness than any monk with an agenda of his own. Early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries scattered across eastern England tell a story with none of the drama of one single dramatic year. There is no scorched destruction layer marking a single invasion season, no mass grave of slaughtered Britons dated neatly to one violent summer for archaeologists to point to and say, "Here, this is where it happened." What the graves show instead, patiently, layer upon layer, is slow accumulation across decades. Burial styles shift gradually, generation folding quietly into generation, the way a coastline shifts under tide rather than storm. Cremation urns of a distinctly continental style begin appearing alongside older British burial customs, not replacing them overnight, but sitting quietly beside them for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes, in the very same consecrated ground. Some cemeteries at sites like Mucking beside the Thames estuary continue in near unbroken use from the very last years of Roman Britain straight through into the new era, the same patch of earth receiving the dead of both worlds without any visible rupture between them, without a single burnt layer to mark a rupture at all. Excavators there found rows of graves spanning centuries, quietly stacked one culture beside another, undisturbed by any single dramatic event. No burning, no panic. Just ordinary burial repeated, year after unremarkable year. Nearby settlements show the same slow drift. Round timber houses giving way gradually to rectangular halls over decades, not in one violent season of rebuilding. That kind of continuity does not sit comfortably beside a story of sudden, violent conquest. It sits far more comfortably beside something quieter and slower: settlement, negotiation, intermarriage, and the simple, unremarkable passage of time. Field boundaries survive unbroken beneath both, hedgerow lines carried forward without a break. Old droveways keep their course, worn by the same cart tracks for generation after generation. Even the rubbish pits in places show no clean line between one people's leavings and another's. Look closely at what was actually buried alongside the dead, and the picture only sharpens further. Brooches, in particular, turn out to tell an unexpectedly intimate story, far more intimate than any spear or shield ever could. Certain cruciform and saucer brooch styles, distinctly Germanic in their origin and craftsmanship, turn up in graves lying alongside older British-style dress fastenings, sometimes pinned to the very same skeleton, on the very same shoulder, worn together in life and buried together in death. A woman might be buried wearing an ornament that speaks quietly of the newcomer's distant homeland, while resting within a grave tradition, a posture, an orientation of the body that speaks just as clearly of the island she herself was born and raised on. That is not the signature of extermination, nor of a population wiped out and replaced wholesale. It is the signature of ordinary households, where a British woman married a Saxon farmer, or a Saxon woman married into an old British family, and their children grew up hearing two languages, two sets of stories, blended together at one hearth, under one thatched roof, by one candle. Isotope analysis performed on tooth enamel from some of these skeletons even suggests childhood spent right here, on this side of the sea, despite grave goods that look thoroughly continental in style. The bones remembered a home the brooches denied. Identity, it turns out, was worn rather than simply inherited. Craft traditions blur too. Potters, clearly trained in old British techniques, begin shaping distinctly Germanic forms, as though a daughter learned her mother's hands but her husband's patterns. Textiles show the same quiet mixing, old weaves carrying new decoration, one skill passed down while another arrived by marriage. Migration, it seems, moved in more directions and at a far gentler pace than any single invasion date scrawled centuries later could ever hope to hold. Small boats, most likely, crossing and recrossing over decades, families rather than armies, farmers rather than warbands, arriving in numbers too modest and too gradual for any chronicler 3 centuries on to render faithfully. None of this erases the newcomer's presence entirely, and it certainly does not erase disruption, because something real and lasting was lost here, and lost thoroughly, whatever gentleness the graves themselves seem to suggest. Within only a handful of generations, the eastern lowlands of Britain stopped speaking a language their grandparents had spoken for centuries beforehand, without apparent struggle, without apparent protest recorded anywhere in stone or parchment. Within a handful of generations, new kingdoms rise bearing new names, worshipping new gods, singing new songs around new hearths, and the old tongue of the island's ordinary people fades from the written record almost as if it had scarcely been spoken here at all. Villages kept their rivers, their hills, their old field boundaries, yet somehow lost the very words their grandparents had used to name them. Think about that for a moment. A whole vocabulary gone, while the fields it once described stayed exactly where they had always been. The hills kept their shape, the rivers kept their course, only the names spoken over them changed. How does a landscape change its speech? That completely, that quickly, without a war fierce enough to leave the graves themselves screaming its name back at us across all these centuries? That is the puzzle the shingle beach at Ebbsfleet leaves quietly behind it, half buried in silt and story alike, unanswered, and it will not stay silent for very much longer. Rest with that question a moment, as the tide keeps turning over the same grey stones. Beneath the churchyards of eastern England, the bones themselves have begun to tell a different story than the old chroniclers ever managed to leave behind. For 400 years, the written record gave us almost nothing. But the skeleton does not need a scribe. It carries its own quiet archive, sealed inside tooth enamel and inner ear bone, waiting for a laboratory patient enough to read it. In the last decade, teams working across Cambridgeshire, Kent, and the flatlands of East Anglia have pulled ancient DNA from burial after burial, cross-referencing it against genetic samples from the near continent. And what they found was not a rumour and not a guess dressed up as certainty. It was a measurable shift, one that a monk with a grievance could never have proven on his own. Across a run of eastern cemeteries, dated to the 5th and 6th centuries, something like 3/4 of the ancestry within some burial groups traces back not to Britain at all, but to the coastlines of what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. A real movement of real people written into the skeleton itself, not merely into a sermon's fury. Entire family groups, buried together, carrying continental blood within a generation or two of Rome's departure. At Oakington in Cambridgeshire, one such cemetery laid bare exactly this pattern beneath the plough soil. Women buried with continental-style brooches sat only feet away from women whose ancestry read as wholly local, sharing the same burial ground, the same rites, the same quiet hillside for the rest of time. Neighbours in death, whatever they had been to one another in life. For a story built almost entirely on silence, that is about as loud as the evidence gets. But travel 200 miles west, out past Wroxeter, out past the old Roman roads curling into the hills toward Wales, and the picture softens into something far less tidy. In cemeteries scattered through Somerset, along the Welsh borders, and down into the far southwest, the genetic signature of the old Romano-British population barely wavers at all. Generation after generation, the same ancestral lines persist, undisturbed, unmixed, as though the upheaval sweeping the east had simply run out of momentum somewhere around the Cotswolds. Whatever swept across Kent and East Anglia thinned to a whisper by the time it reached those western hills, and in places it seems to have vanished altogether. No single wave crossed the island evenly. No one event, no one year explains all of Britain at once. Picture the island, then, not as a single stage with one dramatic entrance, but as dozens of small separate rooms, each with its own door, its own draft, its own slow change of season, and no single narrator moving between them to tell us what happened where. And so the tidy word invasion begins to buckle under its own weight, because an invasion, by its nature, does not stop politely at a county boundary and turn back. Something more patchwork was happening here, something regional, uneven, and quietly strange, playing out differently valley by valley, while nobody thought to write any of it down. Now hold that unevenness up against the map of language, because the two refuse to line up as neatly as they should. Across the counties that felt the heaviest ancestral shift, Brittonic place names all but vanish from the record within a few generations. Rivers keep their old British names here and there, because rivers are stubborn things that outlive whoever first named them, murmuring on regardless of what tongue is spoken on their banks. But villages, farms, hills and fields were nearly all rechristened in a new Germanic tongue, swept clean of their older names as though a page had been torn out and rewritten. Look at any map of eastern England now, and the pattern all but announces itself. Names ending in ing or ham or ton sit thick across the landscape, Germanic in bone and marrow, while genuinely Brittonic survivals can be counted almost on two hands. Here and there, a stubborn exception slips through. A Pensax, an Eccles, a Walton whose very name once meant settlement of the Welsh, as though the newcomers themselves needed a word for the older people still quietly living among them. And yet, in the West, where the bones stayed largely the same, the old language did not simply survive by lucky accident. It thrived, stubbornly, defiantly. Cornish, Welsh and Cumbric, all descendants of that same old Brittonic speech, held their ground for centuries more, in some corners for over 1,000 years, long after the last Roman road had crumbled into the moorland. So ask yourself the plain, uncomfortable question this raises. If the West kept both its people and its words, while the East lost its words far faster than it ever lost its people, then language and ancestry were clearly not moving in lockstep with one another. Something else entirely was steering which tongue a household chose to raise its children in, some pressure the bones alone cannot explain. Status, perhaps, the simple advantage of speaking like the people now holding the better land. Safety, perhaps, in a world where the wrong accent might mark you out at a market or a river ford. Or something as ordinary as fashion, the quiet pull of imitation between neighbours, the the same instinct that makes a child soften their vowels to match a new school playground. Whatever it was, it moved faster through speech than it ever did through blood, faster than any army could have marched. Then there is a quieter mystery still, one that isotope analysis has only recently begun to surface from beneath the soil. Teeth hold a chemical record of childhood, a signature of the water and soil a person grew up drinking and breathing, sealed into the enamel before the age of 12 and never rewritten again for the rest of a life. And when researchers tested skeletons buried with every outward mark of the new Germanic culture, brooches pinned at the shoulder, weapons laid at the hip, grave goods styled entirely in the new continental fashion, some of those very same skeletons carried a childhood signature that was purely, unmistakably local. British soil, British water, a British upbringing through and through. At West Heslington in Yorkshire, excavators found precisely this puzzle waiting in the ground. A woman dressed for burial in every fashionable marker of the new culture. Her isotope signature insisting all the while that she had never once left the chalk hills she was born on. Which means the grave goods lied, or rather told a truth of an entirely different kind. A person could be born on British soil, raised on British water, and still choose, somewhere in adulthood, to be buried as someone new. Not conquered in any simple sense, not replaced. Adopted, or perhaps self-adopted, into an identity that offered something the old one no longer had left to give, whether that was safety or trade, or simply belonging to whichever community still had a future worth planning for. Imagine the quiet calculation behind a choice like that, made privately in a household with no chronicler ever watching, no monk recording the reasoning. A family that had farmed the very same fields under Roman rule, then under no rule at all through the long, uncertain decades after, now watching new arrivals settle nearby with their own gods, their own style of dress, their own way of shaping a sentence. Marriage happens between such neighbors. Trade happens quietly at the edge of a field or a river crossing. A grandmother's stories grow fainter with each retelling, softened at the edges, until a grandchild can no longer say for certain which parts were ever true. And somewhere inside that slow daily mixing, a decision gets made, generation by generation, about which stories to keep telling your children at the hearth, and which ones to let go of without ceremony. Consider how ordinary the mechanism truly is. No decree forced it. No army stood over any single household demanding the change. It happened the way most great transformations happen, quietly, without anyone in the room realizing that history was turning. Nobody wrote that decision down, because nobody in the moment thought it worth recording for anyone else to read. It simply happened at the kitchen fire, at the threshold of the roundhouse, in whichever tongue a mother chose to sing to her child as the light failed outside. So the honest answer, the only honest answer 400 years of near silence will actually allow us, is that we cannot say for certain whether this was migration or assimilation, or a population quietly renaming itself in order to keep on living through a world that no longer had any room left for the word Roman. Perhaps it was all three at once, layered differently from valley to valley, from one river crossing to the next, shifting again with each new decade, never settling long enough for any single witness to describe it whole. The bones speak plainly of movement, quiet and real in the East. The place names speak of loss, just as plainly, though not everywhere at once. And somewhere in the quiet space between the two, an entire people learned how to become someone else, without ever writing down how they did it, or why, or what exactly it cost them along the way. Let that sit with you a moment. This slow and largely silent vanishing act performed by thousands of ordinary families, none of them knowing they were quietly rewriting an island's identity. One household, one grave, one hushed generation at a time. Return with me now to that windswept headland in Cornwall, to Tintagel, where the slate you heard of earlier was only one fragment among many. Decades of digging into the thin soil above those cliffs have uncovered something nobody expected to find in a Britain supposedly gone dark. Beneath the turf lay the footings of more than 50 structures, raised in stone and timber across the 5th and 6th centuries, when the rest of the island was said to have forgotten how to build in stone at all. This was no humble farmstead clinging to the rock. It was a place of real consequence, a stronghold, a seat of power for whoever ruled the far southwest in those Roman-shadowed decades after the legions withdrew. Terraces climbed the slope in tiers, cut into the living rock by hands that clearly answered to someone. Halls stood shoulder to shoulder with storerooms, kitchens, and workshops, a whole working settlement clinging to a headland lashed by Atlantic wind. And the ground beneath the visitors' boots, when finally opened to careful trowels through the last century, told a story of wealth that no chronicle from the period had thought to mention. Nobody wrote this place down. The stone had to speak for itself, slowly, one excavated season at a time. Picture the fog that still rolls in off the Atlantic most mornings, thick enough to swallow the footbridge whole, the same fog that would have curled around those terraces when they were new and full of voices. Excavators working here since the 1930s, and again with far greater precision from the 1990s onward, kept finding the same pattern repeating itself across the headland. Wherever they dug, the story was the same. Wealth, organization, a community that fed itself, sheltered itself, and answered to somebody with real authority in a century when the rest of Britain is so often painted as a scatter of huts and silence. Whoever ruled from this headland commanded labor enough to cut terraces from solid rock, and food enough to feed the hands doing the cutting, month after month, season after season. That kind of power does not appear overnight. It suggests continuity, a lineage of authority stretching back through the last Roman decades and forward into the centuries the chronicles simply failed to record. Because what the archaeologists pulled from that soil was not local pottery of the kind found scattered thinly across most of post-Roman Britain. It was amphorae, tall clay vessels built for carrying wine and olive oil across open water, stamped with the marks of workshops from the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. Alongside them lay fine red tableware, glazed bowls and serving dishes, the kind a household in Carthage or Constantinople might have set upon its own table on an ordinary evening. Somebody at Tintagel was drinking imported wine and eating from imported plates at a moment when Rome itself had already let Britain go. Trade routes that historians once assumed had snapped shut in 410 had, it now seems, simply bent rather than broken entirely. Ships still came. Someone still had the wealth and the appetite and the standing to summon them across hundreds of miles of open sea. It is among the largest known collections of imported Mediterranean pottery from this period, found anywhere in Britain, richer than sites twice its size further east. Whoever held this cliff held connections that stretched further than anyone huddled in the darkened heartland could ever have dreamed, and that alone should humble anyone who still pictures these centuries as empty of ambition. Break a single amphora shard between your fingers, and you are holding a fragment of a voyage that once crossed the Bay of Biscay, past headlands and storms, guided by sailors who knew this exact cove was worth the risk. Wine from Aegean vineyards, oil pressed somewhere near Carthage, bowls fired in kilns whose owners never once imagined their pottery would end up shattered on a Cornish cliff, waiting 1,500 years for someone to piece it back together. Every fragment is a small, stubborn rebuttal to the idea that Britain simply went quiet the moment Rome sailed away. Later sites along this coast, and further inland too, have since yielded the same imported wares in smaller quantities, hinting at a whole hidden network of trade that historians are only now beginning to map along the western sea lanes. None of that, though, is why most visitors climb the modern footbridge to Tintagel today, cameras raised toward the ruins. They come for a story written 700 years after these very walls were last inhabited by whoever built them. In 1136, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote his History of the Kings of Britain, and in it, he placed one particular night at Tintagel that would outlive every genuine record the site ever produced. He told of a king named Uther, disguised by sorcery to resemble another man entirely, slipping past Tintagel's guards to lie with a duchess named Igraine. From that single deception, in Geoffrey's telling, a son was conceived on this exact headland. That son was Arthur. It is, by any measure, a wonderful piece of storytelling, tightly built and impossible to forget once heard. It is also, by any honest reckoning, fiction dressed carefully as chronicle, composed centuries after the fortress on the cliff had already crumbled quietly into memory. Yet the tale stuck to this precise headland so firmly, so completely, that it has shaped how the whole world sees these ruins, ever since, long after the stones themselves had anything at all to do with any king named Arthur. Geoffrey wrote for a Norman audience hungry for a British past worthy of legend, and Tintagel, already ruined, already half forgotten, already wrapped in salt spray and silence, made a perfect stage for him. He never claimed to have dug here. He never saw an amphora shard or a terraced hall. He simply needed a cliff, a castle, and a secret, and this one, standing lonely above the waves, fit the story he wanted to tell better than any other place in the kingdom. And then, in the summer of 1998, the ground gave up something that seemed, for one breathless moment, to close the gap between legend and stone. Archaeologists lifted a broken piece of slate from a drain near the site's summit, unremarkable at first glance, caked in centuries of silt. Scratched into its surface, in Latin lettering dated to around the 6th century, was a name, Artognu. The find made headlines within days. Historians, though, were careful, almost immediately, to slow the excitement rushing in behind it. Artognu is not Arthur. The names share a root, nothing more, common enough across the Brittonic tongue of the period, and no serious scholar has ever claimed the slate names the king of later legend. What it proves instead is something quieter and in its own way more remarkable. That someone here could write, that someone here mattered enough to be named at all in an age we are so often told left almost nothing written down. The caution matters as much as the discovery itself. It would be easy, tempting even, to want this humble stone to answer every question the legend has raised over the centuries. it answers none of them. And that restraint, that refusal to overreach, is itself the more honest story buried in this find. Think for a moment about how easily this could have gone the other way. A newspaper editor eager for a headline, a guide eager for a better tour. A whole industry of certainty could have grown from one scratched fragment of slate, the way certainty so often grows around Tintagel regardless of what the evidence actually says. Instead, the careful voice is held, and the slate sits now behind glass at the Royal Cornwall Museum, offering exactly what it can prove, and nothing more. A small act of scholarly discipline in a place built almost entirely from myth, patiently correcting each visitor who arrives, already certain of what the letters must surely spell. So, here is what remains once the wine jars are catalogued and the slate returned carefully to its case. A cliff that was, beyond any real doubt, a genuine seat of power in the centuries after Rome walked away, trading with lands most of Britain had already lost all contact with. And beside it, layered on top like sea mist settling slowly over stone, a story invented 7 centuries later that gave this real, working, wealthy place an unreal king it never actually held. The archaeology speaks of ships and wine, and a name half remembered on broken slate. The legend speaks of sorcery, deception, and a conceived king who may never have set foot on this headland at all. Which one, you might quietly wonder, is Tintagel actually about? Perhaps it was never meant to be only one or the other. Perhaps power leaves behind its stone, and memory leaves behind its story, and only rarely, on a headland above a cold grey sea, do the two come close enough to almost touch. Stand on that footbridge today, with the wind pulling at your coat and gulls circling somewhere below, and you are standing on both stories at once, whether you notice it or not. Beneath your boots, the post holes of real halls, the shattered rims of real Mediterranean cups, the faint scratch of a real name once carved by a real hand. Above all that, hovering like the mist itself, the sorcery, the secret conception, the birth of a king whose sword and whose kingdom belong entirely to later imagination. Tintagel never asked to carry both burdens. It simply happened to be wealthy enough and remote enough and beautiful enough that history and legend both found reasons to claim it as their own. On a low green hill in Somerset, where sheep now graze along banks that once held a garrison, something happened around the year 500 that nobody wrote down and almost nobody noticed for 1,000 years. South Cadbury Castle had stood empty since the days of the legions, its Iron Age ramparts silent, its ditches slowly filling with leaf litter and rain and the quiet accumulation of centuries. For 400 years, the hill had simply been a hill, grazed and forgotten, its old defensive purpose fading from memory the way a word fades when nobody speaks it anymore. Then, quietly, without a single chronicle to mark the moment, people came back. They dug new footings into the old bank. They raised a timber hall, long and dark-beamed, at the very summit where a chieftain's household might once have gathered centuries before Rome ever arrived on these shores. Archaeologists uncovered its post holes in neat rows, the ghost outline of a roofline pressed into chalky subsoil, and they knew at once this was no accident of farming, no coincidence of ploughing turned up wrong. Someone had chosen this hill on purpose. Someone had climbed back up into the past to build a future. Imagine the labor of it. Green oak hauled uphill on ropes and shoulders, turf stripped back to bedrock, ditches recut by hand with iron tools that Rome had once supplied, and now no longer did. A whole community remembering how their ancestors once kept watch from a height like this, passing down in gesture and habit what no one had bothered to write in ink. 400 years of disuse had not erased the memory of what a hill fort was for, and that alone should give us pause in this quiet, candlelit corner of the past. Think of the distance travelled in that single decision. A grandmother's grandmother might have told stories of the old high place, half legend by then, half practical memory of stone and slope. Somewhere along the way, those stories stopped being merely stories. They became instructions, followed to the letter, followed with urgency, followed by hands that had never held a Roman coin nor seen a legion march. The chalk itself seemed to remember what the written records never bothered to keep. Nothing was written down. Everything, somehow, was still known. And South Cadbury was not alone in this strange, quiet homecoming. Across the west of Britain, the same pattern repeats itself in the soil, hill after hill, region after region, as though some silent instruction had travelled the length of the land. In Wales, forts long abandoned since before the Roman roads were ever laid, saw new ramparts rise, new hearths lit inside old earthworks that had known no fire in living memory. In Scotland, similar refortifications appear at hill forts, whose Iron Age builders were an even more distant memory, their names lost, their purpose half guessed at by the very people rebuilding their walls. Down through the southwest, from Somerset into Devon, and further still, the excavators find the same story written patiently in post holes and ditch recuts, in charcoal layers laid down centuries apart, yet startlingly close in date. This was not one family's private decision, made in isolation on a single hillside. This was a widespread turning, a whole world of scattered communities reaching for the same defensive instinct at roughly the same uncertain hour, unknown to one another, yet somehow moving together. Nothing connects these hill forts on any map we would recognize as political today. No single king's name ties them together in any surviving record. And yet the archaeology insists they moved in step, as though some shared pressure, some shared fear had rippled outward across Britain and found the same answer waiting on every ancient hilltop. Go back up, go back behind a bank and ditch, go back to what your grandfather's grandfathers once knew and trusted. Consider what this meant in practice, across a landscape with no shared government left to coordinate it. Word did not travel by decree. There was no messenger riding between Somerset and the valleys of Wales, carrying orders to rebuild. And yet the timing lines up too closely, generation after generation, hilltop after hilltop, for pure coincidence to explain it away entirely. Perhaps it was simple necessity working the same logic on every threatened community at once, the oldest lesson in the landscape reasserting itself the moment safety could no longer be assumed. What the diggers found inside these walls tells us this was no huddle of frightened refugees clinging to bare earth. At South Cadbury, the debris tells a far richer story. Broken amphorae that once carried wine or oil all the way from the Mediterranean. Fine glass vessels far too fragile for a desperate scramble uphill. The slag and crucibles of active, ongoing metalworking. Someone here was feasting. Someone here was still trading, still commanding enough wealth and enough authority to draw luxury goods across a collapsing world where roads crumbled and markets vanished elsewhere. This looks like a warband's court, a chieftain's hall where loyalty was bought with mead and gifts and gold, not a camp of the dispossessed huddled behind a muddy bank in fear. The bones of feasting animals lie thick in the ditches, cattle and sheep slaughtered in numbers that speak of gatherings, of followers fed well, of a leader proving his worth through generosity rather than fear alone. Whoever ruled from this hill still moved in a world of imported glass and distant markets, even as the towns below emptied and the old certainties dissolved into silence. Trade routes that should have collapsed with Rome somehow still reached this remote Somerset summit. Ships and mule trains carrying luxury across a Britain most histories describe as broken beyond repair. That contradiction alone should unsettle any tidy picture of total collapse, and it should make us wonder what other quiet continuities the darkness still hides from view. The hearth still burned, the horns still passed hand to hand in the firelight, and somewhere beyond the ramparts, the dark held whatever it was they had gathered here to resist. Picture the scene as the excavators must have pictured it, kneeling over a spread of broken pottery in the Somerset rain. A hall lit by tallow and firelight. Warriors seated along both walls, their weapons close at hand, their loyalty renewed with every cup passed down the table. Outside, the ramparts held the night at bay, freshly cut, still pale where the turf had been stripped away. This was authority rebuilding itself from nothing, one feast and one favour at a time, on ground that memory alone had told them was safe. It was the 19th century that gave South Cadbury its most famous nickname, when antiquarians walking these same green banks began to whisper the word Camelot, tying the hill to Arthur's legendary court through little more than local folklore and a wishful reading of old chronicles. For a long while, serious archaeologists rolled their eyes at the association, embarrassed by its whiff of romance, its Victorian eagerness to plant a fairy tale castle on a perfectly ordinary Somerset hill. And yet, excavation in the 1960s, led with real scholarly rigour, forced a second look at what the ground actually held. The timber hall was real. The feasting was real. The date, sometime around 500, sat uncomfortably close to whatever half-remembered war leader the later legends were eventually built upon, layer by layer, story by story. No archaeologist today will tell you Arthur himself dined on this hill. But many will tell you, quietly and carefully, that whoever did dine here was exactly the kind of figure the Arthur legend eventually grew around. A warlord holding a fragment of order together on high ground, feeding his men, watching the lowlands for smoke on the horizon, and for worse things besides. Later centuries would dress the same hill in armour and heraldry it never wore, in banners no Dark Age warband ever raised. Mallory never walked this ground. Tennyson never smelled its wet grass at dawn. But strip away every later embellishment, every stained glass version of the story, and something genuine remains underneath. A real hall, a real feast, a real hilltop chosen in a real moment of need. Perhaps that is enough to earn the name, even if only as a shorthand for a truth history forgot to record properly. So the question settles over the hill like the mist that still gathers there some mornings, soft and unwilling to lift. What made an entire generation dig new ditches into abandoned earthworks their own ancestors had walked away from centuries before, in a time of supposed peace? What threat was large enough, and close enough, and lasting enough to send whole communities scrambling back to defences that Roman order had once made unnecessary? No burnt letter survives to name the danger by its true face. No frightened voice was written down to tell us plainly what was coming over the hills in the grey light before dawn. Only the banks themselves remain, quietly rebuilt, quietly waiting, carrying that unanswered fear forward into the deepening dark that follows. Was it raiders from across the sea? Was it rival warlords fighting over what little order was left? Was it something slower and stranger, a fear less easy to name than any army? The hill keeps its own counsel on that question, as it has for 1,500 years, and for now we can only stand at the edge of its ditch and listen to the wind moving through grass that once, briefly, sheltered a king's fire. Somewhere between Gildas's silence and the chroniclers who followed him, a name begins to gather weight, and that name is Arthur. 4 centuries after the fighting Gildas so bitterly described, a Welsh monk working under the name Nennius sat down, by candlelight most likely, to compile a history of the Britons out of whatever fragments still survived. In it, he listed 12 battles, fought and won, he claimed, by a war leader called Arthur. Not a king. Not yet a king. Not in his own telling. Not in any early telling at all. The Historia Brittonum calls him Dux Bellorum, a leader of battles, a title that smells of old Roman command structures clinging on in the West, long after the empire itself had gone home and stopped answering letters. It is a working title, not a royal one, the kind of phrase a scribe reaches for when no grander word quite fits the man being described. 12 battles, named rivers, a wood, a fort, a hill, one after another, each one a small stone laid onto a growing cairn of reputation. Glein, Dubglas, Bassas, Celadon Wood, Ginion, the city of the Legion. Names that scholars still argue over, unable to fix half of them onto any map with confidence. And at the 12th, on a hill called Baden, Nennius claims 960 men fell to Arthur's charge alone, in a single day, by his hand and no others, a number so large it reads less like a battlefield report and more like a boast passed hand to hand across generations. It reads like triumph carved carefully into memory long after the blood had dried into the chalk. It also reads, to careful eyes, like legend already hardening around a kernel that may or may not have been real to begin with, the way frost thickens on a window until the glass itself is barely visible beneath it. Nennius himself admits, almost shyly, that he has only heaped together what he could find, a compiler rather than a witness, gathering old fragments the way a man gathers driftwood on a cold shore without knowing which plank came from which particular wreck. Then the dates arrive, and with them a stranger kind of trouble than silence ever was. A century after Nennius, another set of chroniclers compiled the Annales Cambriae, the Welsh annals, working year by year like a candle burning down a long corridor of forgotten winters, marking deaths and portents with the same flat, careful hand. Tucked among entries for eclipses and the deaths of bishops sit 2 lines that historians have picked over for 100 years without ever quite agreeing. The Battle of Baden, the annals say, fell in the year 516. Camelot, the battle that ended him, in 537, 21 years later, almost to the season, as though someone somewhere had once known the calendar precisely and simply forgot to say how. Neither date appears anywhere in Gildas, who lived closest of anyone alive to the events themselves, and wrote while the memory of Baden was still, by his own words, fresh enough to sting. He never gives Baden a year at all, only a distance measured out in his own lifetime, muttered almost in passing. the way a man mentions his own birth year without ever needing to prove it to a stranger. So the precise numbers we do have arrived generations after anyone who could have remembered firsthand, copied by hands already working from memory or rumour or a hopeful kind of reconstruction built to fill a gap nobody wanted left empty. A confident year offered without hesitation for an event nobody living through it thought worth precisely dating at the time it happened. That gap between the later record's confidence and the earlier silence is where the whole mystery quietly lives, patient as moss on a north-facing wall. Some scholars suspect the annals borrowed their dates from older Easter tables, calculating backward through cycles of the moon rather than remembering anything at all. Others think a real memory survived, roughly, and only the precision was added later to make the past feel more solid than it ever really was. A comforting number stitched over a wound that had never properly closed. Historians faced with that gap have split into camps that have never fully reconciled, not in a century of careful argument conducted mostly in dusty journals nobody outside the field reads. One camp holds that beneath the legend stands a real man, a regional war leader perhaps, operating out of the West Country or the old Welsh borderlands, commanding a warband small enough to know each other's faces, who won one real battle against Saxon expansion and bought the Britons a generation of uneasy peace they badly needed. His deeds simply grew in the retelling, the way deeds always do around a hearth at night, embroidered a little more with every fresh audience. Another camp argues for a composite figure instead, a single convenient name that gathered up the victories of several different local leaders scattered across 100 years of intermittent fighting, until later storytellers folded them all together into one hero, because one hero travels better than 5. And a third camp, no less serious than the other two, argues for something closer to outright invention. A figure built centuries later out of half-remembered place names and a hopeful kind of patriotism, given false weight by writers who needed a British answer to Rome's own founding myths, a native Aeneas to set against an empire that had abandoned them. All three camps can point to real evidence for their reading, real gaps that their theory fills more neatly than the others. None of them, after 100 years of trying, has managed to close the case for good, and none seems likely to next year either. A fourth, quieter position simply refuses to choose, holding that the question itself may be wrongly framed, that asking whether one man existed misses how memory actually worked in an age with no fixed spelling, no shared calendar, and no single version of any story that everyone agreed to keep. And the case stays open partly because of what is missing, rather than what has been found. No inscription anywhere across Britain names him, carved into stone, or set above a doorway, or scratched onto a boundary marker, the way Roman officials once scratched their own names for eternity. No coin bears his likeness or his title, however small the mint, however local and short-lived the currency it served. No contemporary charter, no land grant, no boundary dispute preserved carefully in some cathedral archive mentions a king or a war leader called Arthur signing anything, granting anything, or being addressed by name by anyone still living in his own lifetime. Set that silence beside other early medieval rulers we do know existed, men whose names survive on coins or in charters, witnessed by real courtiers standing in a real room at the time, and the absence around Arthur turns almost eerie by candlelight. a man who supposedly held back an entire migration, who won battle after battle across the length of a fracturing country, left behind less physical trace than a minor landowner arguing quietly over a hedge boundary in some forgotten shire. Somewhere in that discrepancy sits the thread this whole chapter turns on, gently, without ever quite resolving into an answer either way, a thread we will simply have to carry forward, unresolved. Not proof that he never existed, only proof that if he did walk those hills in that armor, breathing that same cold air, the world around him left almost nothing durable for us to hold in our hands so many centuries later. Even his weapons have vanished into story rather than soil. No blade in any museum case carries a plausible claim to his hand. No scabbard, no shield boss dug from a riverbed with his mark upon it. Whatever iron he carried, if he carried any at all, rusted back into the same anonymous earth that swallowed everyone else's belongings, kings and foot soldiers alike, without troubling to sort one man's memory from another's. Scholars have sat with this exact problem for 100 years now, turning it over carefully the way you might turn a worn coin without a face, hoping the light will catch a detail it never quite does. And the honest ones will tell you plainly that the evidence does not improve with study, however patiently and however long it is studied. New excavations occasionally reawaken the debate. A stone here, a hillfort there, a fresh trench cut through old turf that briefly makes the newspapers. But nothing yet found has tipped the balance decisively toward man or myth, toward memory or clever invention. A hillfort's refortified ramparts can prove a warlord commanded labor and loyalty in that century. They cannot prove which name he answered to, or whether anyone beyond his own household ever spoke it aloud. The debate has become, in its own quiet way, part of the story itself, a mystery examined so thoroughly from so many careful angles across so many careers that its very thoroughness has only confirmed the mystery rather than dissolved it into something plainer. So we leave it here, exactly where the scholarship has left it for a century, neither proven nor disproven. A name suspended between 12 battles recorded in a monk's careful Welsh Latin, and a silence in the stone and metal that should, by rights, have carried his memory forward into ours. Whatever walked the hills of sub-Roman Britain in those uncertain years, it left its footprints only in words written down long after the ground beneath them had gone quiet again. In the summer of 1939, on a low green mound above the River Deben in Suffolk, an archaeologist named Basil Brown began to dig where local traditions said nothing lay. He was wrong. Beneath the turf, faint stains in the sand traced the shadow of a ship, 90 feet long, its timbers long since rotted to nothing, but its iron rivets still holding the ghost of its shape, curve after curve, as if the vessel itself refused to fully vanish from the world. Brown worked with a trowel and a patience that history has since rewarded many times over. He had no formal training, only years of quiet fieldwork behind him, and almost nobody expected him to find anything of consequence at all. War was declared in Europe within weeks of the discovery, and the treasure was hurried underground again, this time for safekeeping in a London tunnel rather than a Suffolk mound. At the ship's centre had once stood a burial chamber, and inside it lay a hoard almost too rich to believe. There was Byzantine silver, a set of bowls and spoons carried or traded from a court thousands of miles to the east, further than most people of that age would ever travel in a lifetime, let alone own anything made there. There was a great iron helmet, its face a mask of bronze and garnet, patterned after styles worn in distant Sweden, its eyebrows and moustache forming the shape of a dragon whenever the light caught it just right. There were gold buckles, coins struck across the channel, a wooden lyre reduced to fragments and later painstakingly rebuilt, and a whetstone carved and capped like a scepter, as if kingship itself had been laid to rest beneath that quiet Suffolk field. Weapons lay beside the body too, arranged with an evident care that even now, all these centuries later, still reads as deliberate ceremony rather than haste. A great ceremonial sword, a shield decorated with a bird of prey, spears bundled together as though for a journey rather than a grave. Whoever commanded this burial commanded resources few in Britain could match, and connections stretching from Scandinavia to the eastern Mediterranean at precisely the moment the old story insists was one of poverty, isolation, and forgetting. You, standing on that mound today, would be standing above one of the richest burials ever uncovered anywhere in northern Europe. And yet, no name was carved anywhere to say whose it was. Historians have guessed, carefully and at length, weighing coin dates against king lists, chronicle fragments against genealogy, one theory quietly replacing another across nearly a century of study. Raedwald, a king of the East Angles who died around 624, fits both the dates and the sheer scale of power the burial implies, and most who study Sutton Hoo lean toward his name when pressed, though few will say it with total certainty. Others have proposed his son, or a rival East Anglian noble whose deeds never survived into any later record at all. But guesswork is not proof. The ship gives up no signature, no inscription, no seal, no single object that says unmistakably, "This man ruled here, and this was his name carried into the earth." The bones themselves had long since dissolved in the acidic Suffolk soil, leaving only a faint human-shaped stain in the sand where a king, or someone very like one, had once lain surrounded by his treasure and his ship. So the identity of England's grandest burial rests on inference alone, a puzzle assembled from artifacts and absence rather than any voice speaking clearly from the age itself. It is a small, strange thing to sit with. A man commanded enough wealth and craftsmanship to be buried beneath a 90-foot ship dragged up from the river, and still history nearly let his name slip through its fingers entirely, into silence, into guesswork, into a mound nobody thought worth digging for 1,000 years or more. 70 years later, in 2009, a different kind of gold surfaced, not beneath a ship, but beneath an ordinary ploughed field near Hammerwich in Staffordshire. A man walking with a metal detector, searching for nothing more than loose change and belt buckles, began pulling gold from the soil in quantities that made no sense at all. Then more again, until the find could no longer be kept quiet, and archaeologists were called before the light even faded that first evening. The field itself cordoned off almost overnight, while word spread quietly through the county. By the time the excavation was finished, they had recovered over 4,000 individual pieces, the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold ever found anywhere, weighing more than 11 pounds of pure metal alone, without counting the silver fittings beside it. Every fragment had to be lifted, numbered and photographed before it could even be washed, a process that stretched on for months after that first astonishing afternoon. But this was not treasure in the way Sutton Hoo was treasure. There were no cups here, no jewellery meant for a queen's throat, almost nothing peaceful in the pile at all. Nearly every piece had been torn from weapons and armour, sword hilts, helmet crests, fittings stripped from blades with a violence that felt deliberate, almost ritual, gold peeled carefully away from the wood, and leather it once adorned, and left loose and scattered in the ground like petals shaken from a single dying flower. Whoever gathered this hoard had access to the finest war gear an entire kingdom could produce, forged for princes and champions, and carried into battles no chronicle ever named, and then chose, for reasons entirely lost to us, to strip it bare piece by piece. Picture the scene for a moment. Warm gold catching low autumn light as careful hands worked blade after blade apart, piece after piece. A task that must have taken hours, perhaps days of patient, silent labour, performed with no witness that history ever thought to record, in a place we cannot even be certain was chosen for any reason beyond convenience. A low ridge beside an old Roman road that once carried far heavier traffic than a single quiet burial party. Even the style of the decoration hints at workshops serving more than one kingdom at once, as though the gold itself had travelled widely before it ever reached that quiet field. And there the mystery only deepens, because nobody knows why any of it was buried at all. Was it plunder, gathered from a defeated army on some forgotten battlefield, and hidden by the victors for safekeeping, until calmer days returned to that stretch of Mercia, a kingdom that spent much of the 7th century at war with its neighbours? Was it an offering instead, gold surrendered to earth or river gods in gratitude, or in fear of something worse still coming down the road toward them? Or was it simply hidden wealth, tucked away during some sudden crisis by a man who fully meant to return for it later, and never could? We cannot say, and perhaps we never fully will. Every theory offered so far explains part of the puzzle and leaves the rest untouched. What is certain is only this: whoever buried it never came back to claim it. No pit was ever reopened. No later hand ever retrieved a single ring or fitting from that quiet Staffordshire clay, not in a decade, not in a century, not across the whole slow turning of the medieval world above it. The gold lay undisturbed through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through Viking raids and Norman conquest, through nearly 13 centuries of English history unfolding directly above it, season after ordinary season, harvest after harvest, gathered from the very same soil by farmers who never once suspected what waited beneath their boots. Only the field itself remembered silently that something extraordinary slept just beneath its furrows, waiting for a stranger with a detector and a quiet afternoon to spare, and the patience to keep walking one more row. And here the deeper paradox settles in, quiet and almost impossible to shake off. This is meant to be Britain's Dark Age, a stretch of centuries defined by silence, by broken roads and empty Roman towns, by a world supposedly stripped of both skill and ambition alike. Yet somewhere in those same shadowed decades, unnamed craftsmen working by candlelight and forge glow were producing gold work of a delicacy that would not be matched again in England for hundreds of years afterward. Garnet cut wafer thin, backed with tiny stamped gold foil to catch and throw back every scrap of available light. Set with a precision that still stops modern conservators cold under their magnifying lenses, centuries later, in laboratories that did not exist when the gold was made. A civilization history remembers mostly for what it lost was. In quiet workshops we cannot name and cannot place on any map, making some of the finest metalwork anywhere in Europe at that time. Two treasures, a king's ship and a warrior's stripped-down hoard, both point to the very same quiet truth. Skill did not vanish with Rome. It simply stopped writing itself down. No chronicle boasts of it. No king claims credit for it in any surviving charter. The gold simply exists, patient and unexplained, telling its own story without a single word of help from the age that made it. Gold that outlasted the kingdoms that made it, resting patiently in English soil through everything that came after, waiting centuries simply to be noticed again by hands that finally knew how to look. Walk across a map of eastern and central England, and something strange becomes clear almost at once. Villages, towns, hamlets, the small clustered places where people actually lived and worked and buried their dead, carry names that are almost entirely Germanic. Endings like tun and ham, and by and thorpe, tidy little suffixes stamped onto the land by Saxon and later Viking tongues. Look for the older names, the British names, the ones a Roman surveyor or a native farmer would have recognized in the year 400, and in many counties east of the old frontier, you will search for a very long time indeed. A scattering survives. Most does not. It is one of the strangest silences in this whole silent age, because it is not a silence of parchment or of graves. It is a silence written into the land itself, spoken every day by people who have no idea they are speaking it. Something happened to the words people used for the places they lived in, and whatever it was, it happened almost completely. Historians who count these things, and some have spent entire careers counting them, find that pre-Saxon settlement names in much of lowland Britain survive only in a small handful of cases, a scattering of exceptions against a landscape otherwise renamed from nothing. Compare that to Wales, or to Cornwall, or to Cumbria, where British names remain thick on the ground even now, and the Eastern Gap becomes almost eerie in its completeness. Think of it this way. Somewhere in Norfolk or Leicestershire or Lincolnshire, a farmer in the year 400 called his fields, his ford, his little cluster of huts by names, in a British tongue that his grandchildren, within a few generations, would no longer recognize at all. Nobody wrote down the moment the old name stopped being used. Nobody recorded the day the new one took hold. The change simply happened, quietly, house by house, field by field, until an entire vocabulary of home had been replaced without a single surviving complaint. And yet, lift your eyes from the villages to the water, and the picture reverses entirely. The rivers kept their old names. The Thames is British. So is the Avon, which is not really a name at all, but simply the British word for river, borrowed so many times by incoming speakers that England now has half a dozen rivers, all technically called River. The Trent kept its name. The Severn kept its name, and so did the Dee, the Ouse, the Wye. A whole network of ancient waterwords, still murmuring through modern speech, still printed on road signs, still said aloud by people driving to work with no notion that they are pronouncing, more or less, what a Roman-era Britain would have said. The hills, too, in many places, held their shapes and their names longer than the settlements around them did. Whoever moved into this landscape, in other words, seems to have kept the words for the large, permanent, shared features. The rivers you had to ford, the hills you could see for miles. while sweeping away the names of the smaller human places, the farms and the hamlets, the words that belonged to a household rather than to a whole valley. It is as if two peoples agreed, without ever writing it down, on which parts of the world were too big to bother renaming, and quietly renamed everything else. Picture a Saxon settler standing at the edge of a river he had no British word for, and simply keeping the one already in use, because a river does not care who names it, while a small huddle of farm buildings a mile inland got a brand new word entirely, built from his own tongue rather than borrowed from anyone still living nearby. Rivers cross whole regions and outlast whole peoples. Villages do not. Perhaps that alone explains why water remembered what earth forgot. The river was simply too large, too old, too indifferent to human turnover for anyone to bother giving it a new name. Why this happened is one of the oldest arguments in English history, and it has never fully settled. One camp has long argued for something close to replacement, that enough Romano-British communities in the lowland east either fled west or died, or were pushed aside in sufficient numbers that incoming Germanic speakers simply had no one left to borrow village names from. So they built new names from scratch, because there was, in a very real sense, no one there to ask. A second camp points instead to elite dominance. A smaller number of Germanic-speaking newcomers, but ones who took charge, who became the lords and the landholders, and the men whose word decided what a place was called on any document that mattered, while the older population carried on farming underneath them, gradually losing its own tongue, not through death, but through daily disadvantage. A third and quieter theory suggests something almost more unsettling than either, that many Britons chose the shift themselves. If speaking the new tongue meant better trade, better standing, better marriages, better treatment before whatever passed for law, then abandoning the old British place names, and eventually the old British language altogether, might simply have been the practical choice of people trying to get on in a changed world. No slate, no charter, no grave inscription tells us which of these is correct. The evidence is the land itself, mute and thoroughly renamed, offering no explanation for its own transformation. Each theory has its defenders. Each theory has its gaps. A wholesale replacement struggles to explain why so many other traces of Romano-British life, field boundaries, farming patterns, even some burial customs, seem to carry on with quiet continuity in exactly the regions where the place names vanished most completely. An elite takeover struggles to explain why the change ran so deep, reaching down into the humblest hamlet rather than stopping at the halls of the newly powerful. And voluntary shift, however plausible in theory, leaves us guessing at a decision that an entire population apparently made and never once wrote down for anyone to read again. What makes the puzzle sharper still is how little the vanished tongue left behind, even in the everyday speech of the people who supposedly absorbed its speakers rather than replacing them. If large numbers of British speakers simply carried on living, working, marrying into Saxon households, generation after generation, you might expect their old words to have seeped upward into common use, the way loanwords usually do, arriving in ordinary conversation long before they ever reached a document. Instead, the harvest is startlingly thin. A handful of dialect words in the western and northern counties, a few terms for landscape and livestock, and simple tools that scholars can trace back with real confidence to British roots. survive here and there in regional speech, like fossils pressed into old stone. Present, unmistakable once identified, but sparse against everything that ought to have come down if the two populations had simply blended their words in the ordinary give and take of shared farms and shared markets. Compare this thinness with what happened centuries later, when Norman French crashed into English and left thousands of words sitting comfortably inside everyday speech within a couple of generations. And the difference becomes almost unsettling. Something suppressed the older tongue far more completely than conquest alone usually manages, and no contemporary voice, not even Gildas in all his fury, pauses to describe how, or when, or whether anyone at the time even noticed it happening. A crag in Cumbria still called by something close to its old British word. A word for a small stream tucked into the dialect of Devon that traces back further than any recorded king. A term for a particular kind of hillside pasture, still used by shepherds in the north, older than the language surrounding it on every side. These are the fossils, small, scattered, almost accidental survivals, more precious for how few of them there are. Because that, in the end, is the strangest thread of all in this particular mystery. Language does not usually vanish from a landscape without a great deal of noise. It vanishes amid recorded complaint, amid schools built to stamp it out, amid songs of resistance and grandparents grumbling that the young no longer speak properly. Britain's lowland tongue seems to have gone under with none of that left on record. No sermon against it, no law forbidding it, no lament for its passing. Only the rivers still murmuring their old British names beneath bridges built by people who had entirely forgotten what those names once meant. Somewhere in that gap between the water that remembered and the villages that forgot, an entire language slipped beneath the surface of Britain, and the land has never once told us how. No chronicler mourned it in writing. No later poet composed a lament for what had been lost, the way poets so often do once a thing is safely gone. There is only the map itself, patient and unbothered, carrying its two kinds of memory side by side. Rivers that still speak, villages that no longer do, and beneath both of them, somewhere, a silence that has outlasted every empire built on top of it. Let the water keep its old names a little longer, and let the question keep its rest. There is a strange silence sitting inside the English language itself, and it has nothing to do with missing charters or lost chronicles. It has to do with words. When historians count the Brittonic words that survived into Old English, the language the incoming settlers brought and eventually made dominant across the lowlands, the tally comes to almost nothing. A handful of names, a scatter of river words, a few terms for hills and valleys. Perhaps a few dozen everyday terms in total, depending on how generously a scholar chooses to count. And even then, the list barely fills a single page. Compare that to what usually happens when two peoples share a landscape for generations, trading, marrying, arguing over the same fields and the same wells. Language does not normally vanish that cleanly. It leaves fingerprints everywhere it touches. It leaves loanwords for tools, for foods, for kinship terms, for the small domestic vocabulary of daily survival that people borrow without even noticing they have borrowed it. Old English has almost none of that from the tongue it replaced. 2 words for hills, maybe 3. A scattering of names for geographic features that no one thought worth translating. A shadow, really, where a whole spoken world should be standing solid and unmistakable. A word for a badger, borrowed almost unchanged. A word for a low hill, another for a steep-sided valley. That is close to the whole surviving inventory once the place names are set aside. No word for bread, no word for family or friendship or fear or love. No word for the plough that turned the same soil or the loom that wove the same cloth. Nothing of the vocabulary that fills an ordinary day survived the crossing between the two tongues. Even the very word the English used for the native Britons, a word that survives today in Wales and in Cornwall's old borders, seems to have meant something closer to foreigner or even slave, a small bitter clue about how the two peoples came to regard one another, set against what 4 centuries of close contact should have produced. This thinness becomes almost eerie to sit with. Think of what happened elsewhere when one language pressed hard against another for so long. French absorbed a great deal of Frankish vocabulary after the Germanic conquest of Gaul. English itself would later absorb enormous quantities of Norman French after 1066, reshaping its grammar and vocabulary within a couple of centuries of conquest, leaving thousands of words behind as proof of that long entanglement. Yet here, in the very landscape where Roman Britain slowly became Anglo-Saxon England, the linguistic exchange looks almost one-directional, almost silent, almost as if one side simply stopped speaking somewhere along the way. Fields were farmed by people who must have spoken Brittonic, within living memory of people who spoke something else entirely, something Germanic and new and increasingly dominant. Somewhere, surely, there were households where both tongues were heard under the same roof, at the same hearth, over the same evening fire, parents muttering one language while children answered in another, growing up fluent in neither the old world nor quite the new one either. And yet, so little crossed over into what became the common tongue of the land. It is as if a river changed its course overnight, leaving no old channel behind it, no old bed carved visibly into the earth for later travelers to trace with any confidence. Something happened to the spoken tongue of Roman Britain that not even the place names alone can fully explain. Something faster or something harder than simple gradual drift across ordinary, unremarkable generations. Archaeologists find the same stubborn puzzle waiting for them in the soil, layer after layer. Pottery styles shift, building methods shift, burial customs shift, sometimes within a single generation in ways that trade alone struggles to explain. Yet none of that tells us what was actually said aloud in the fields, or why the words for the crop, the plough, the cattle, and the child so rarely crossed from one tongue into the other. 2 explanations are usually offered for this thinning, and neither one is entirely comfortable to sit with for long. The first imagines something close to social apartheid, a hardening of status between the incoming English speakers and the native British population, so severe that intermarriage and daily exchange were rare, and prestige attached only to the newer tongue and to the people who spoke it fluently from birth. Under that model, British speakers who wished to be heard, to trade freely, to hold any standing at all in the new order, simply abandoned their own language and adopted the other, generation by generation, in households and marketplaces alike, until the old speech survived only in private, whispered indoors, then, eventually, not even there. Legal texts from later centuries hint at exactly this kind of hierarchy, setting different values on British and English lives under the same law, which some scholars read as an echo of an older, harsher divide. It is an uncomfortable thought. A whole people, quietly written out of their own daily speech by the pressures of the world they now had to survive inside. The second explanation is gentler in tone, but no less dramatic in its final outcome. It imagines a rapid, thorough shift, driven not by cruelty, but by plain practicality. A tongue traded away quietly because it opened doors that the old one no longer could open for a farmer, a trader, or a bride marrying into a new household with new neighbours. Either way, the result reads the same on the page centuries later. A whole spoken inheritance carried by hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, thinned down to a whisper within only a handful of generations. No sermon records the moment. No law announces it publicly in so many words. It simply happened, somewhere in the candlelit dark of those centuries, quietly enough to leave almost nothing behind to prove exactly how it unfolded, or how quickly, or in which valleys it happened first, and in which it happened last. And yet, the old tongue did not disappear everywhere across these islands. Push west, toward the mountains of Wales, the far granite tip of Cornwall, the misty hill country that would in time become Cumbria in the north, and the old British speech held on stubbornly against every pressure. Welsh grew directly from it, spoken today by hundreds of thousands of people, taught in schools, written proudly on road signs beside the English words printed beneath them. Cornish faded almost to nothing by the modern era, its last fluent speakers dying quietly in fishing villages before careful revivalists coaxed it patiently back into living use once more in recent generations. Cumbric, spoken once across the whole north, slipped away more quietly still, leaving traces mainly in place names and in a handful of old shepherds' counting rhymes that some still recite today without fully knowing what they preserve inside them. Numbers passed down like half-remembered songs. These are not relics kept behind museum glass, dead and labelled. They are living relatives of the very language that all but vanished from the lowland heart of what had been Roman Britain, proof that the tongue did not die everywhere at once, only in the places where the new settlers pressed hardest, stayed longest, and built their new order most completely and most permanently. In the valleys of Wales, the old tongue still shapes the hymns sung in stone chapels on a Sunday evening. In Cornwall, it survives in the names fishermen still give to certain rocks and coves, half English now, half something older beneath. In the fells of old Cumbria, it survives only as a memory folded into a children's counting game, numbers recited over sheep at dusk, by people who could not translate a single other word of the language they were using. A whole civilization's daily speech, spread once across a whole province, reduced in one quiet corner of the land to nothing more than a nursery rhyme murmured over sheep. So, the mystery folds quietly in on itself, the way mist settles back over a valley once the wind has dropped. A language spoken by a whole nation, in daily use for 400 years of Roman rule, and for centuries more before that rule ever began, should have left far more trace in the speech that eventually replaced it across the lowlands. Instead, it left rivers with old names, a few scattered borrowed words, and an almost total quiet where its everyday vocabulary once lived and breathed among ordinary people. Whatever happened in those farmhouses and market squares, in whatever mixture of pressure, fear, ambition, and quiet private choice, reshaped how ordinary families spoke to one another across a single lifetime. It happened fast enough and thoroughly enough to erase most of the evidence of its own unfolding. The old tongue still breathes, faintly but surely, at the western edges of these islands, in Welsh chapels and Cornish choirs and old northern rhymes. But at the heart of what became England, it slipped away almost without a written trace, and no one now can say exactly which winter evening, in which quiet house, beside which dying fire, it was finally allowed to fall silent for good. Perhaps that is the truest shape of this particular mystery. Not a single dramatic event, but thousands of small private choices, made in kitchens and fields and marriage beds, never written down because no one thought them worth recording, and now forever out of reach. A whole people's spoken world, closed over as quietly as water closing over a dropped stone. In the shadow of the Cheviot Hills, where the land folds gently down toward the River Glen, archaeologists uncovered something that should not have existed in an age with no written records at all. Beneath the turf at a place now called Yeavering, they found the outlines of great timber halls, their post holes marching in orderly rows through the soil, like the ghosts of walls long since rotted away. One hall stretched nearly 30 meters in length, its roof once held aloft by rows of oak posts, sunk deep enough to bear the weight of centuries, each post hole packed with rubble to keep the timber from shifting in the wind that still rakes down off those hills tonight. And beside it, more curious still, lay something almost theatrical. Rows of curved timber benches, rising in tiers like a small amphitheatre, faced a raised platform where, it seems, someone once stood to be seen and to be heard. Historians call it a grandstand. Nothing quite like it survives anywhere else in Anglo-Saxon England. No one is entirely sure what to call the gatherings it once held, whether law court or council or something closer to a coronation performed again and again for each new claimant. Picture it at dusk, hearth smoke drifting low across the benches, firelight catching on damp wood, the smell of tallow and wet wool thick in the evening air, hundreds of unnamed faces turned toward a single wooden seat. Somebody spoke there. We will never know their exact words, only that whoever stood on that platform commanded enough authority to gather an entire valley's population in one place, in silence, to listen. Excavators working the site through the 1950s and again decades later found traces of a great enclosure ditch running alongside the halls, and a curious wooden temple structure too, its floor scattered with the burnt bones of oxen, as though feasting, and something closer to sacrifice once happened side by side beneath the same overcast sky. A palisade once ran the length of the settlement. Nothing here was accidental. Every post was set with purpose, every bench angled just so toward the platform, and even now, walking the empty pasture where the grandstand once stood, the shape of that vanished authority still presses up faintly through the grass. What makes Yeavering stranger still is what lay beneath it, older than any Anglo-Saxon king could have known when his builders first broke ground. Buried beneath the halls, archaeologists found traces of an earlier Brittonic sacred landscape, a ring of post holes suggesting a stone or timber circle, and a great mound raised long before the newcomers ever arrived in this valley. This had been holy ground, or gathering ground, for the native Britons of the region well before the Angles ever set foot in Northumbria. Perhaps for centuries beforehand, its purpose already half forgotten even by the time Rome withdrew. Somehow, this memory was not erased. It was inherited quietly across a boundary of language and blood that everywhere else in this story seems to have been so bitterly contested. When the incoming warlords needed a place to assemble their people, to hold court, to be crowned in all but name, they built their halls directly atop a site the Britons had already marked as significant, as though some knowledge of its meaning had passed between two peoples who otherwise left almost no record of speaking to one another at all. Was it coincidence? Was it calculation, a deliberate seizing of an older authority to lend weight to a newer one? Perhaps the new rulers understood instinctively that power borrows more easily from ground already thought sacred than from ground that means nothing at all. Nobody wrote this down. Not one line, not one name. The soil simply remembered what the parchment never did, and it kept that memory intact for archaeologists to read 14 centuries later. Consider what that continuity actually required. It meant a Brittonic-speaking population still living in the shadow of the old mound, still tending some memory of what it meant, long enough to pass that meaning sideways into Anglian hands. Two languages, two peoples supposedly locked in conquest and displacement everywhere else in this story. And yet here, on this one hillside above the River Glen, someone chose continuity over erasure, chose to build upward rather than to raise and start again. Nobody recorded why. Into this near-total silence, one voice breaks through, brief and almost offhand. The monk Bede, writing his ecclesiastical history in the early 700s from his monastery at Jarrow, mentions a royal residence called Ad Gefrin, where King Edwin of Northumbria was said to have sat with his court around the year 625. He gives us barely a paragraph, a single passing sentence tucked inside a much longer story. He does not describe the halls, the benches, the mound, or the ditch that once encircled the whole complex. He is far more interested in the Bishop Paulinus, standing waist-deep in the nearby River Glen, baptizing crowds of converts week after week for over a month, while the king apparently looked on from his hall above. And yet that single passing name, Ad Gefrin, is the thread that let archaeologists centuries later match the excavated timbers in a lonely Cheviot field to an actual named king, rather than to an anonymous ruin. Without those few lines from a monk who almost certainly never saw the site himself, Yeavering would simply be an unlabeled scatter of post holes, mute and unattributed. Bede was not trying to preserve the place for us. He barely paused there at all before moving on to the baptisms that interested him more. But his glancing sentence became, unknowingly, one of the only anchors tying this whole corner of Dark Age Northumbria to a name we can still speak aloud tonight. It was the archaeologist Brian Hope Taylor, who, digging through the 1950s and 60s, finally matched spade to sentence, matched a field of grey post holes near the modern farm at Yeavering to that single fossilized name in Bede's text. Without his patient years of trowel work, the connection might never have been made at all, and the halls would have stayed forever anonymous, a puzzle with no key. A single sentence, dropped almost carelessly into a much larger history, turned out to be the only door back into an entire vanished court. And yet, Edwin was never the only king to stand on that platform, nor even the first, nor likely the last. When excavators peeled back the layers of Yeavering's largest hall, they found it had not simply stood and fallen once. It had been built and burned, or dismantled, and rebuilt again and again, each version slightly larger, slightly grander than the one before it, as though every new ruler needed his own hall to prove he was not merely inheriting another man's house. Layer upon layer, generation upon generation, each with its own post holes cut cleanly through the last, its own hearth laid fresh over older ash and older bone. Some of these halls belong to rulers no chronicle ever named, kings and warlords whose reigns left no trace in any surviving text, whose only monument is a pattern of dark soil that a trowel, carefully drawn across the ground, can just make out under a grey Northumbrian sky. We do not know how many men sat on that dais before Edwin's time, how many councils were held there, how many disputes settled, how many marriages sealed, how many alliances forged in a hall lit only by firelight and breath and the low murmur of an assembled valley. Bede remembered one king and gave him a name we still repeat. The earth remembers all of them, every rebuilding, every fire, though it will not give up their names, however long we kneel beside the trench and ask. At one point, the entire settlement seems to have been abandoned in haste and burned, its great hall reduced to charcoal and collapsed roof timber, only for a new hall to rise again nearby within a generation, as though the disaster had barely interrupted the rhythm of kingship at all. Who fled that fire? Who rebuilt afterward? The post holes cannot say, and the charcoal, however carefully sifted, keeps its silence too. Carry this forward now, gently, as the story nears its close. Yeavering is not really an exception, however singular it feels standing at the edge of that empty field. It is a glimpse of the ordinary, magnified only because someone thought to dig. Somewhere in nearly every river valley, across what would become England, halls like this one were rising and burning and rising again, kingdoms coalescing quietly out of the wreckage Rome had left behind, mostly beyond the notice of any chronicler who might have thought it worth the ink to write down. Bede caught one flickering candle in an enormous darkness and called it Edwin, and called it Northumbria, and let the rest go unrecorded. But the dark itself was full of other lights, hundreds of them, burning in halls whose names, whose builders, whose small triumphs and quieter failures had been swallowed whole by 4 centuries with almost nothing written at all. What we now call England was, in truth, assembled largely in that silence, hall by hall, valley by valley, king by unnamed king. Some of those halls have never been found at all and never will be, ploughed flat by 1,000 years of farming, or simply lost beneath towns that grew up over them without anyone below ever suspecting what timber and bone lay sleeping in the clay underneath. Yeavering only speaks to us because a monk once mentioned it in passing, and because, centuries later, somebody with a trowel happened to be listening. Let that thought settle, unhurried, as we turn at last toward what all of this might finally mean. So, think back, if you will, to that slate at Tintagel, the one we began with tonight, a single scratched name pressed into stone by a hand that has been gone for 1,500 years. It told us almost nothing. No title, no family, no reason why anyone bothered to carve it there at all, on a windswept headland above a cold Cornish sea. And yet, somehow it told us everything about these 4 centuries, because that is the shape this whole story has taken, over and over, night after night of gently digging through what little survives. A name with no biography attached to it, a wall with no chronicle to explain who built it or why they left, a grave with no epitaph to describe the person curled quietly inside it, waiting patiently in the dark soil. That is the strange, stubborn inheritance of Britain's dark age. An age that is dark not because nothing happened within it, but because almost no one thought to write it down while it was happening around them. Consider, for a moment, everything we have actually walked through together tonight. A legion sails away across a grey channel, and a letter arrives soon after, telling frightened towns to fend for themselves from now on. A busy Roman street empties out within a single lifetime, its baths falling silent, its forum growing quiet, its timber halls slowly settling into the mud beneath new grass. A warlord is remembered only by the men who despised him, his own voice never once recorded, never once his own. A single furious monk writes down the one contemporary account we possess of this entire era, and even he seems far more interested in scolding careless kings than in describing the world around him. Ships arrive at a marshy inlet on the Kentish coast, and no one now can say for certain whether they were invited guests or unwelcome invaders, or something slower and far messier than either simple word allows. Bones stop speaking Latin somewhere in the soil, and quiet geneticists in white coats comb patiently through what little is left of them, searching for a truth that stone alone could never tell. A cliff-top fortress becomes a legend that eventually outgrew it entirely, swallowing the real place beneath centuries of story. Old hill forts feel armed feet again after centuries spent sleeping peacefully under grass and gorse and grazing sheep. A battle that everyone agrees happened, and that no one, in all this time, has ever managed to find. Gold is buried in Staffordshire and in Suffolk soil, and simply left there, unclaimed, patiently, for well over 1,000 years. Villages quietly swap the names their grandparents once used, and no living person now remembers precisely when or why. A whole spoken tongue, once carried proudly by millions of ordinary people, slowly thins down to a handful of tucked-away corners across these islands. And in the end, tonight, a wooden hall rises at Yeavering in the northern rain, and kingship itself begins to take on a shape it never had a written name for. Not yet. Not for a long while still. 15 separate scenes. 15 separate mysteries, really, strung together across 4 centuries like beads on a single quiet thread. Each one interesting enough to fill an entire evening on its own. And yet, none of them, not one, comes to us with a tidy ending attached. Notice now the pattern threading quietly through every single one of those separate stories. It is always the very same imbalance repeating itself. Too much stone and far too little parchment. Too many bones and blades and beads, and hardly a single honest written sentence left behind to explain what any of it truly meant to the people who once held it, wore it, buried it, fought bitterly over it, and then quietly went to their own graves without saying a word about it that has ever come down to us. We are left, mostly, holding beautiful, silent objects and asking them questions they were simply never built to answer for us. And that gap, that stubborn silence between the thing itself and its missing story, is precisely what keeps historians circling this period, century after century, refusing quite to let it go, refusing to look away. But take some quiet comfort from this too, because the silence is not entirely permanent anymore, not the way it once seemed to be. Ancient DNA, drawn patiently from old teeth and from the dense petrous bone behind the ear, is slowly starting to trace who actually moved into Britain during these missing years, and how quickly and how thoroughly, in ways that no chronicle from the time was ever equipped to record for us. Isotope analysis can read a person's childhood diet and even their childhood geography out of a single surviving tooth, quietly telling us where somebody was born and raised, long before any parish register ever existed to note such small human things. Laser scanning from the air, what specialists call LiDAR, strips the trees and hedges away from a hillside in mere seconds and reveals the ditches and ramparts that centuries of patient ploughing tried so hard to erase, uncovering forts and farmsteads that no old map ever thought to mark. Ground-penetrating radar quietly walked across a sleeping field in straight, patient lines, can sketch the buried outline of a hall or a ditch without a single spade ever touching the soil. Even the humble radiocarbon date, refined again and again over recent decades, now narrows a burial to a window of years instead of a window of centuries. None of these careful new tools hand us finished, tidy answers, and none of them ever will. Each one mostly hands us better, sharper, more interesting questions than the ones we quietly started with. And that, in its own patient way, is exactly how this stubborn period keeps rewarding careful, unhurried attention year after year, decade after decade, dig after quiet dig. And here, finally, is the honest truth we should sit with gently before we close our eyes tonight. Every specialist we might call upon to explain any single piece of what you have just heard would still argue about it, passionately and at length, and probably deep into the night, over cold tea and older books. Whether Arthur was one man or several men folded together, or no man at all, only a memory wearing borrowed armor. Whether the Saxon story was truly invasion, sudden and sharp, or a slow, patient blending across 100 quiet, overlapping years. Whether Gildas exaggerated his fury for effect, reaching for drama, or whether things truly were that grim along those grey western coasts. Whether Vortigern was one single tyrant at all, or a title passed between men, or simply a convenient scapegoat invented later by people who badly needed someone to blame for a hard and hungry century. Whether the hillforts were refortified out of fear, or out of ambition, or simply out of habit, passed down from grandparents who remembered older, safer walls. Whether the gold at Staffordshire was a battlefield offering, or a nervous burial ahead of a threat that never quite arrived, or something else entirely that no one alive can now name with any confidence. These are not settled matters, resting quietly somewhere in comfortable agreement. They are living arguments still being fought gently in journals and conference halls and quiet university offices, 400 years after the events themselves took place and some 1,500 years after the fact settled into dust. Perhaps that, in the end, is the truest thing we can say about this whole stretch of British history. It refuses, gently but firmly, to fully surrender itself. Every generation that turns its patient attention here believes it will finally be the one to solve it completely. And every generation instead adds one more careful, patient, evidence-based layer of guessing to the pile. A pile that somehow only grows more fascinating rather than less mysterious as it slowly grows taller. Maybe these 400 years were never truly meant to be solved at all. Maybe they were only ever meant to be listened for, gently, the way you might listen for a faint voice through a thick stone wall, catching a single word here, a name there, and letting the rest stay softly hushed. Perhaps that is not a failure of history at all. Perhaps it is simply the shape this particular history was always going to take. a shape built from gaps as much as from facts, and there is a certain quiet peace to be found in finally accepting that. So let the mystery simply sit with you now, instead of pressing so hard for its answer. Let Tintagel's slate keep its quiet, unnamed name. Let Wroxeter keep its long silence. Let the gold in that Staffordshire field stay buried safely in memory, unclaimed, needing nothing more from you tonight than a soft acknowledgement that it is there, resting, somewhere beneath the dark modern fields you may be picturing right now. Quiet fields with sheep dozing in them and hedgerows swaying gently in a slow night wind. The truth of these vanished centuries is still resting patiently, undisturbed, in absolutely no hurry at all to be found before morning comes. And you too can rest now in exactly that same way, letting the last 400 years of an old and endlessly quiet island drift gently, gently, out of reach, unsolved and unhurried, as you finally, softly fall asleep.